First up, we've got Adrian Bevington. Good morning, Adrian.
Good morning, guys. Delighted to be with you today.
Wonderful. Also joining us is Jen O'Neill. Jen, good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, champion. Thanks, champion. Last but not least is Steve Walsh.
Hi, Steve. Morning.
There we go.
But just to run through the panel for this session, Adrian Bevington, Pro Profile UK MD, Jen O'Neill, former editor of She Kicks magazine, and we're going to touch on what Jen is up to a little bit later on this session. And of course, Steve needs very little introduction, has obviously worked in the scouting and recruitment loads of top clubs, and most recently working with the ownership group over in MLS side Charlotte. So good morning to you all. I hope that you are all well, and we're going to dive straight into it. And Tony and I we've sort of pulled rank, and we've decided what we're going to have a chat about initially. And what we want to start off with, and we're going to come to you, Jen, first, is we want to talk about the women's game, and we want to talk about, you know, we've got the NUCO operating the top divisions of women's football, and my question to you is women's football on a positive track? Is it on a positive track, or are there still lots of room for improvement?
Yeah, absolutely. It's on a positive track. They've secured the 5-year broadcast deal with Sky and BBC, which is massive. So people can see that audiences are growing. NWSL just got the highest TV audience for their title game at the weekend. So it's not just in the UK, but obviously we're talking about issues here, aren't we? And so there are still issues. If you think about WPLL are bringing in sponsors, but is Adobe for the Women's FA Cup, which the FA have got, the same as the Emirates? It's not. So there's more money coming into the women's game, but it's not on the level that you would see in the men's game yet. Lots of positive things. I mean, I've got a list I can go through to just pepper people's thoughts, and I'll maybe sort of throw that in at the end. But yeah, there are hugely positive things happening, but that shouldn't cloud the fact that down the pyramid there are concerns, and the women's game is replicating and echoing some of the issues that we see in the men's game, and we're not doing anything about that. And that's a concern. Fixture congestion, all those things you see in the men's game are happening in the women's game. But peculiarly, in the women's top 2 tiers, we've got a contradiction of the top teams are playing too many games. And in the championship, they're not playing enough games because Reading dropped out. So we're having almost this sort of weird situation where we've got clubs like City, like Arsenal, like Chelsea, complaining they've got Champions League, they've got international matches for their players, they've got a lot of league games, and then in the Championship tier 2, they go weeks without matches sometimes.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing as well, Jen, is that women's football doesn't want to replicate what the men are doing. They want to start, not with a blank page, but they want to do it their own way, if you like. And I think, is that something that you're aware of?
Well, that's the rhetoric. Is that the reality? Is that the reality? Because at the top end of the game where they're aiming for success, then clearly that's how it's going to go, because these are clubs owned by men's clubs, and if it's been successful for the men's club, then you do that. And there are huge disparities in terms of resources for the top sides.
Yeah.
I think there's a Charlie Methven's obviously a popular character for some people. I mean, he came out and said that, and I think there's some truth in it, that 80 to 90% of chief execs wouldn't want their women's team to get promoted to the WSL because they can't afford it. Yeah. And there's a lot of virtue signalling about you should spend this on the women's game and you should invest in the women's game in this way, but they're not the people who are having to put their hands in the pockets. Yeah. So there are lots of things to think about, but I don't want to say that this is a negative conversation, because yeah, the women's game is going in the right way, but there are still concerns and there are big
Well,
gaps.
well, Jen, I have got a vested interest in the women's game now. I'm representing one of the head coaches in the women's game, Becky Langley up at Newcastle. And I was up at St James's not last Sunday, the Sunday before, to watch Southampton at St James's Park. Now, the Newcastle women's team have got a couple of fixtures at St James's. They had 12,000 there. The atmosphere was great. So, some clubs are doing a lot. Some clubs, and I probably would use Arsenal as the example. Is Arsenal perhaps the flag bearers here? Could you just tell us a bit about Arsenal?
Yeah, I think in terms of just crowd sizes, they're getting between 40 and 60,000. They're playing so many games at the Emirates, but you're also witnessing a schedule clash, which is another question mark over the women's game. If the men's side has a game, then it kind of biffs the women's matches, which has happened. There's been a fixture clash come up, and they've sold tickets for the women's game, and they're having to move it to Boreham Wood, which is tiny. And when do you put those matches on TV as well? But yeah, Arsenal are the flag bearer in that sense.
Yeah. Do you want to come in here, Adrian?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting debate, this, and I'm someone who's got quite a lot of experience previously around women's football and seeing the a huge growth from when I first experienced it with the England women's team back 25 years ago. I think one thing that really interests me is the point about fixture scheduling here, and the point that was made about the rhetoric about women's football can it had a clean sheet of paper. Obviously, there's going to be similarities to how you reach the top and how you manage it. Finance ultimately will determine so much of this, and we realise it. But there's still an opportunity to do certain things differently along the way, because it's still quite fresh and quite new, and people are open to new ideas. One thing I'm interested in is like the fixture scheduling. Just because someone might already be a committed supporter of the women's team, there may also be many people who are supporting the men's teams who can't actually physically get to all the games because they're playing on the same day sometimes. Now, for me, that's something that should be set out very early. I know there's congestion, it's not straightforward, but to try and ensure wherever possible that the women's teams can play on the stadium pitch has got to be a bonus where possible. Certainly not clash the fixture on the same day where the men's team might be playing a completely different part of the country to where the women's team are going to be. I think that should be a starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this came up in the last forum about where's like a natural home for, the Saturday 3 p.m. is the natural home for the men's game. Do you think there's an acceptance in the women's game that obviously that isn't going to be the case? And of course there's problems, isn't there, with Sunday evenings or Friday nights? I mean, where does your gut instinct tell you, Jen, that the natural home might end up?
Well, historically, the women's game was always played at 2 p.m. on a Sunday. Certainly in the UK, that was the time that women could get onto the pitches. So that's when it always was. That doesn't work necessarily for TV games. So when we talk, what we're talking about is the top level here. And you're right, and I've talked about it, and the people within the top levels of the game who organise these things are broadcasters. They're right, they don't know where it fits. They've tried 3 p.m. They've got round the blackout. They've got permission on a Saturday. But yeah, I'm not sure when. And they're moving them to quite often Sunday early and Sunday late. Well, if you're trying to grow a fan base, so away supporters just cannot do that. It's so difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jen, you mentioned Newco. What's the name of it now? Women's Professional
Leagues
Limited.
Or League Limited, yeah. WPLL.
League Limited,
very catchy, isn't it?
Yeah. But I suppose it's their job. Is it their job to negotiate and to navigate all these nuances for the women's game and to get it in the best place possible? You mentioned the 5-year broadcasting deal, but I suppose that's just the start, is it?
Yeah, they've only been running the game since August, so it's still pretty early days for them. They don't have a sponsor for their League Cup yet. That used to be Continental. So there's lots of areas for them to expand and to grow. And I think they're still trying to work out who their audience is. I think there's still this tendency to think that it's young girls and it's families. And if you actually go to games, that's not necessarily the case.
Interesting. I want to ask Steve. Steve, when your time in America, did you get a sense what the Americans thought of what was going on in England with women's football. Obviously, women's soccer in the States, obviously massive. Obviously, they've got our best coach as their national team coach. Was there a sense of they're getting their act together in England, or was there a sense of let's wait and see?
I think they see it as emerging, and emerging at quite a rapid pace. And when the USA are coming to take our best coaches, and Emma Hayes is a brilliant example of that, then I think it just shows how much respect people in the US have got for English soccer. As they call it in America, it's got to be called soccer, because we call football, it's NFL, and we get into all sorts of problems then.
Yeah, it's interesting. Jen, one thing I wanted to ask you that I picked up on a couple of weeks ago, and it was the first kind of time that I'd seen it in the women's game, and it was like a men's game support of frustration towards a coach, the Man United coach, and it was basically calling for the coach to be sacked. I think the women's game was hoping that it wasn't gonna see that type of relationship, but was that always a bit naive?
I think the murmurings against the Manchester United coach have been going on for quite a while. I think it was more like vividly seen in Jonas Eidevall's departure from Arsenal, because the fans weren't happy. Is that necessarily a negative thing, to have fan engagement, to have fans who care? I think the problem is, if you think what you see on social media is what everybody thinks. Don't ever believe what the noisy people on what there used to be Twitter.
What I'd say is, I think they were asking him to go in a bit more of a polite manner than what maybe the men's coaches are subject to.
Yeah.
And what about the national team? And I want to bring Adrian back in on this as well, but you first, Jen. There seems to be a massive amount of pressure on the England's national team now to go and deliver, as it is the men's as well. Again, is that realistic? Are we at the point of being even stronger than what we were, or what's your assessment?
Well, the competition at the elite level of international women's football is massive. So to assume that just because they were so brilliant in 2022 and in the Euros, they can carry on doing that is a little bit naive. But I think that the pressure is put on themselves by themselves. They're a top tier team. They have such brilliant backing financially by the FA. They're playing in one of the best leagues in the world, and other players are playing in other leagues. Georgia Stanway at Bayern, for example, is doing brilliantly. Kira Walsh at Barcelona. So you've got these excellent talents and a great system behind them as well. But Spain and the USA are probably slightly ahead of them. We'll see. I don't think it's unrealistic, and I don't think it's unfair, because, and you see the backing they get in. I think there's a sellout at Wembley again for the USA game. The interest and the support is there, and they put that pressure on themselves.
Yeah, Adrian, you're no stranger to international competition. You can have all the best prep, you can have all the best players. It's hard to go and win things, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think echoing what Jen said there is absolutely right. England, this is not something that's happened overnight. There's been a massive commitment by the FA and clubs over a long period of time. We are in England now one of the elite nations in world football, and the level of work that's gone on behind the scenes reflects that. Should we be challenging at the latter stages of every tournament? Yes. Does that mean we've got a divine right to be winning tournaments? No. You can say the same for the men's team. I think the women's team and the men's team are running very similarly parallel at the moment, which is great for English football. Not just English football, it's great to see the work going on in Scotland, going on in Wales, going on in Northern Ireland. There's a lot more exposure than ever before. There's a genuine commitment. I remember putting the first game on at Wembley of England women back in, I think it was 2013. And it was a real challenge to get people in high profile situations in the media to even put a tweet out to support the game. You know, that was a battle back then. I think we got about 45,000 for that game, which was a capacity crowd that we were allowed in the safety license at that time. But watching the evolution of it, watching the way that the players are looked after now is so much better. And I think that they've got to just embrace that pressure. They seem to be doing a brilliant job, and I think they're great ambassadors for the game generally.
And Adrian, I was going to say, from the outside looking in, which is what I've done with women's football, the women's game, have the Lionesses driven that growth, you know, whereas the clubs are very, very strong, you know, in the men's game. And
well, I think the Lionesses have got to take a lot of credit for what they've done over the past decade. But, you know, Arsenal were mentioned earlier.
yeah,
You rewind back to when David Dean was involved with Arsenal, you know, and Vic all those years ago, when they were committed to this way before nearly anyone else in English football. Then we've seen what Chelsea have done, the great work that Steve's referenced there with Emma Hayes, who's just been such a transformational coach for English football, and brilliant that she's doing so well in the States now as well. But there are a lot of people who've played their part in building this along the way. The most important thing now is that it's embraced fully, and as many clubs as possible that can afford it commit as much as they can afford to sustain the clubs. That the women's teams then aren't just the first point of, oh, we can't afford it anymore. They cease. If you are a commercial partner and you want to get involved with a football club, the ideal football clubs you want to be involved in are clubs that have got great men's and women's teams, because they make it more of a great commercial fit for you. So that I see the growth continuing, but it's got to be you know, worked at continually. It's not an easy one.
Excellent. Okay, well, just before we wrap up this section on the women's game, Jen, do you want to just give us a brief overview of a project that you're working on at the moment?
Well, it's just something that maybe will sort of trigger people to think about the value of tradition and history in the past and the stories from the men's game and how enriching that is to the sport and actually quite marketable. Can you, other than Adrian, who obviously remembers what happened in the 90s, can anybody else on this call actually genuinely say they know about the Premier League from 1991 when it started in the women's game? I don't think that people do know where to find those stories and that information. And on that token, myself and another ex-journalist, Tony Layton, are working on a project for the FA in terms of archiving the FA Women's Premier League, which became the FA Women's National League. So there's so many brilliant players and personalities and teams that people just don't know about. And I think there's a nostalgia vacuum in the women's game, which across the world, which will be hopefully mined in the future.
If any of our attendees, any of the delegates can help with that, Jen, is where can they input stuff into, or what do you want? We'll share it. We'll share it in the chat at some point. Yeah,
I mean, we're putting it together. It'll go hopefully live in April, bit by bit. But yeah, and then people can feed into that, because there are gaps. Yeah, it is worrying because a lot of it is in people's lofts or it got thrown out. And I think the FA are the first federation in the world to actually be trying to do this constructively.
That's great. I like that phrase, nostalgia vacuum. That's like a sort of 90s indie band, isn't it, or something like that. Right, let's move on and let's talk about fixture overload. Now, Tony, I saw a stat yesterday that Jude Bellingham has played something like 213 league games, and David Beckham had played at the same age, had played 57
Oh,
games.
really?
That few.
Wow.
So obviously we've got all sorts of rumblings in respect to fixture overload. We've got the players talking about potentially taking some action. But Steve, I want to come to you. Do you see fixture overload as a genuine issue for player welfare?
Absolutely, 100%. If you look at what they've done with the Champions League and the other European leagues, straight away we've got more fixtures. Whether they're successful or not, it doesn't matter. And I think that's very worrying. I think another point that is highlighted here is that maybe players would like to play for England, but feel that they're too tired from the domestic competitions and the European competitions that they have to participate in, that are actually voting with their feet and saying, well, look, if we're playing Lithuania away, it's a massive trip for me. I've got to travel again. And when I come back, I'm not giving my best to the club as well. So nobody's getting the best of me. I'm tired when I go there. I'm tired when I go back. And I'm not doing myself any favours. And it's not about loyalty and wanting to play for England, but it's about preserving yourself to know that you're the best, in the best shape you can be to represent both your club and your country. So the players who were kind of picking and choosing, it looks to the general public like they're picking and choosing, and really they're not. They love to play all the time, but it's an impossibility when you look at how many fixtures they've got to play. And I think that's a very important factor in this.
Adrian, I think I'll come to you here, Adrian, because there was some dropouts in the National League game, wasn't there? I don't know what the exact thing was, but the National League.
It was 8, wasn't it?
The Nations League, yeah. The Nations League, Adrian, is it considered to be friendlies dressed up in a league by some of the England camp? What do you think?
Well, I think there's a much broader debate than this, and it's not a new debate. Let's be honest with you. This is, players dropping out of national team squads is not new, particularly with England, I might add. Problems I experienced myself over a 20-year period. So it's not a new debate. I think there is an important element to this that has been highlighted here. We have an increasing number of games, like Steve's referenced there, with the new dimension to the European club competitions. That's a great way. It really concerns the very elite players who are playing all these games, not players who are necessarily playing further down the pyramid in all countries, I might add. Not every country has the same challenges. And I think we have to be very careful how we discuss and debate fixture congestion. We also have to look at what's the reason or one of the driving factors behind fixture congestion. Well, it generates far greater revenue. And who takes the biggest chunk of revenue from fixture generation? Well, players' salaries.
Nice.
So I'm not here to try and drive down players' salaries, but I think it's part of cause and effect. And if you want greater salaries, clubs have got to be able to bring greater revenues in. Certainly federations and co-federations have got to be able to bring revenues in. I do think players are playing too much football at the very elite end of the game. I don't think their bodies can possibly, the pace they play at now, they're real athletes. The figure you've just given there about Jude Bellingham, which was new to me, that's a really startling figure. But I think we have to really deconstruct what are the core elements of this before simply saying, oh, well, they have to play less games. How do they play less games?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was Phil Foden had done 76. He'd had 76 game involvements in that season that culminated in the Euros. Yeah. And that's a lot of games.
So, Tony, so to come back at you, we're talking about England specifically, understandably, while we're on a, you're based in England. This is a football transfer forum from the UK. But Brazilian players, Argentinian players, they seem to go around the world 3 times over every time it's an international get-together. They very rarely call off. There's a real desire and commitment. And I would say as well, I think it's really important to reference here. I think Gareth Southgate, when he was the England coach, I think he built up a real collective spirit where the players really wanted to turn up and be there. That wasn't always there previously. So I think it's about the culture and the environment that you create.
And Steve, what I like, I think, is the players are getting a voice. The players have just been done to all the time, and it seems like they're the stars of the show, and they go on and they perform, and they've got really no stake and no say. They weren't consulted about any of this, and some of the elite players have come out, haven't they, and sort of raised this issue.
I think they've got a point. We are, at the end of the day, as Adrian intimated, we're only talking about the elite end, and we're not talking about the average. I mean, most championship players would die to play for England, so it's not an unwillingness. but I think it's about looking after yourself. And unfortunately in football, we are driven very much by the profit margins that are established by the clubs, but also by the national team as well. They want to get their revenue streams in, and if you've got a full fixture against Brazil at home, even though it's a friendly game, there's a good chance you're going to sell out Wembley. But to do that and provide maybe another extra game, you've got to get the best players to play against Brazil. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation there. So it's a difficult one. But the elite players, again, Adrian's mentioned, are playing too much football, and they have got a point. And the public don't sympathise with them because they see the salaries that they're earning, and you can't earn a salary with a broken leg. It's you certainly don't earn it, and I think the overplay is a real problem, and going back to what they've done to the European leagues, we're playing extra fixtures.
Yeah.
And why are we playing extra fixtures? Because we need more money, and I think the clubs have got to ask that question. And what else worries me in these terms is that we're getting maybe closer and closer to a European elite league. And I think this is maybe one of the stages that UEFA have put forward to try and maybe marry that up in the future. And that is a big worry, certainly to the Premier League, I suspect. Because if that happens and the two things have got to run side by side and they've got to play a game every week in Europe, where are we going to go then?
Can I just come on one final point from me? Sorry to hog the conversation here. You asked me about the Nations League specifically, Tony. And I think, again, let's not see this just through the lens of England. If you talk to a lot of countries outside of England, they treat the Nations League extremely seriously, and the positivity of being promoted to play better, stronger nations season after season is a massive fillip. So I think we have to be really cognizant of not seeing it just through an English lens.
Yeah, I totally agree, Adrian. I was over with the Georgian Football Federation, and they were like, the Nations League is for us. They qualified for the Euros via the Nation League playoffs, and they take it very, very seriously. So it's a great point.
Hey, and we were all San Marino, weren't we, last week, seeing those lads get promoted? Absolutely unbelievable. Just a couple of comments that are in the chat. Matt, hi, Matt Portis. Wayne Rooney had played more minutes than Bellingham by the age of 20, but he makes the point that the intensity of the games has increased. Has the genuine opportunity for a break, and also a comment from Tim Barton about actually, and you make the point, Adrian. You look at the lower leagues actually, and the volume of games that they're being subjected to as well. Dare I say, on less favourable pitches as well is obviously another consideration.
And in a time when we've just increased the injury time and extra time that's played in games as well, so we've increased the fixtures. And we've actually increased the length of games just by a couple of minutes, but it's still, those are the couple of minutes at the end of the game when you're tired and injuries, and we've seen a lot of injuries.
Yeah, of course.
As well.
Jen, I just want to get your thoughts on this, specifically about some of the injury concerns in the women's game as well, and about sort of overloading players. What's the chat in the women's game about managing congestion?
I think as you would imagine, it echoes the concerns that happens in the men's game. Interesting as well, thinking about South American players heading over from Premier League matches to play for their nation. Quite a lot of the top WSL players are Australian, and they're flying across the world backward and forwards in each FIFA window quite often. And so it wasn't a surprise. Sam Kerr, one of the most famous and successful players in the women's game, suffered an injury and then another injury. When FIFA Pro measure, as people probably are aware, FIFA Pro measure, and you can check the amount of travel time and play time that players have over a season or 2 seasons, and the amount of travel she did.
Yeah.
In addition to the number of matches and game time was astonishing. So it was almost like you could see it coming. You think for 2-3 seasons, what a phenomenal athlete she is, but she's not unbreakable, and it happened. And so ACL injuries, as everybody will be aware, is a big concern in the women's game, and there's more money being put into it. Michelle Kang is the woman with the endless pot of money investing in London City Lionesses and clubs in the US, but she's also putting money into research into ACL injuries. But it's the same. They're humans. There are differences and nuances in terms of gender, but the outcome is often the same. Ask somebody to do too much and they'll break eventually.
Yeah, that hits home. That hits home, that one, Tony. Right, brilliant. Let's move on and talk about the incoming football regulator.
Do we have to?
Do we have to?
Do we have to? The politicians have got in on our webinar.
Yeah, I know.
How's that happened?
But normally it's me just having a moan about it, but I've got a really good question for Adrian, because actually FIFA, Adrian, wrote to Lisa Nandy, the minister, the DCMS minister, asking for an idea of when all of these powers that the regulator is going to be given will be handed back to the FA, because ultimately that's where FIFA want the football to be run on. Is that just a fantasy now that, you know, all of these decision makings around what people can spend, can't spend, and having the ability to do that even onto the Premier League is now just a sort of distant fantasy for forever in the future?
Is that one question, right?
Yeah, I think so.
There's about 5 there, Adrian. Yeah, just do what you can remember.
Yeah.
I wonder why you came to me with that one. Look, obviously from FIFA's perspective, they always like the federation in any respective country to be the people who are, in their words, running the game, the governing body of the game. I think we've seen the dimensions move so much in our own football over the past 30 years or more, with the inception of the Premier League, the growth of the Premier League, and also you look at the EFL, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful product. You know, and you've got Rick Parry and Trevor Birch, in my opinion, doing a great job there as the leadership there. Who has ultimate control? Do we really want to see politicians running football? Not personally. I'm not sure that that's really what they want to be doing either. I think there's obviously there's a school of thought that everyone's aware of here, so I'm telling everyone not to suck eggs, but you know, there's a school of thought in some people's minds that it needs that independent voice to give a better decision making, and that's a matter of opinion, and there's very strong views both sides on that. I don't have a hard answer for you, to be honest with you, as to how that plays out long term. I think the most important thing for me here is there's just good people having as much sensible dialogue as possible in what is a very complicated space. When you have so much power and finance with the huge clubs in the Premier League, you have a national federation, you have a league body, and look, we're seeing ourselves at the moment, the challenges at the Central Premier League, which is actually really a collective of the clubs themselves and what they're managing. It's not easy for anyone to come in and try and do this. So it's about a sensible approach as much as possible, that whoever it is, however they're doing it.
Just a question to throw out to the audience. Has anyone read the document from the independent football? It's a big document. I haven't read it. I don't think many people will be bothered to read it, to be honest.
The actual bill.
The actual bill itself. So if you have read it, put it in the chat and we might come to you for a bit more knowledge on this particular subject.
Yeah, I mean, Steve, you've been in the game a long time. You know, what's your reaction to the idea that?
Well, first of all, I would say leave it to the professionals being the FA. But if that's not going to happen, collaboration is the way forward. You know, if you're doing anything at all, you need to get expert advice. and the government to make decisions without actually referencing the FA, it would be ludicrous, in my opinion. So I think that if it has to go down that route, then collaboration is the way forward. But better to leave it to the professionals.
Steve, do you think it might, if the football regulators working in collaboration with the FA, it might give the FA a bit more teeth to challenge some of the bigger issues that clubs might be thinking about, or that football in this country might be facing? And we're talking, right down the pyramid. I think one of the things that the financial regulator is hopefully going to do is stop rogue ownership, rogue owners, people putting money into a club and then just walking away. Do you think that might help, that it gives a little bit of teeth for the FA to use?
I think theory is fantastic, but in reality, how are they going to do that?
Yeah.
How is it actually going to work in reality? So from that point of view, we'll just have to see what happens. Obviously, the government's the government who make decisions, but they may be overturned by the football authorities and may get us kicked out of competitions. That's been muted as well. So we've got to try. The government have got to tread very carefully on this, because what they don't want to become is unpopular. And I think if England were thrown out of a couple of competitions, the government would certainly, next time round, we could have Boris back in charge.
I think that was the goal.
Just pick up on that last point though, as well, from Steve there. I mean, look, you can't begin to imagine that we're ever going to reach a situation where political interference, as it might be deemed internationally, is going to play such a role that leads to such an outcome. I think we've got to also focus on the fact of, look, we've got some big issues that occur, whether it be around the financing of the game to the health of clubs further down the pyramid.
Yeah.
But ultimately, what we have got, and we can't lose sight of this, in the men's and the growth of the women's game over the past decade, we've got a fantastic football system in this country. We've got the best domestic league in the world that's watched by more people. We've got brilliant clubs that perform in Europe every season so well. We've got a brilliant championship. We've got a great pyramid underneath that, and we've got a great growing women's game. We've got brilliant academies. We've got great stadiums, great facilities. There are things occasionally that need addressing, that need to be managed sensibly. As Steve said there, it's about good dialogue. It's about people working together collegiately, but you don't always need to have a sledgehammer to crack a nut here. We've got a good product. Don't lose sight of that.
Well said there, Adrian.
Thanks, Adrian.
Jen, the regulator is, I guess, from a women's game perspective, he's actually quite favourable on the women's game, putting more pressure on teams to adopt more resource into the women's games, things like that. Are there any concerns from the women's game about the regulator?
I can't imagine that. I think if you consider that they're under the umbrella of a men's club anyway, and if you want pressure for a club to overspend on something that they can't afford, you have a Reading dropped out of the championship. So it has to be sustainable. As Adrian said earlier, the investment in the women's game, we want it, but it has to be sustainable and it has to be sensible. And Karen Carney's report was instigated and funded by the government, and is useful, but it has no power. But it's always good to have an independent body or review to look at how things are going and what can be improved. But the devil is always in the detail, as Steve says.
Brilliant. Right, we've only got a few minutes left, so I want to try and get through some of the questions that people have asked on the Q&A box. So Joe asks, hi guys, question for Jen. My biggest exposure to women's football so far has been via social media. What I've seen on Twitter, X and TikTok is an investment from supporters in characters and individuals in a much more concentrated way than the birth of the rise of men's football. There seems to be a lot of attention and focus on the individuals within the team than purely the team itself. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how it possibly affects the future of the women's game and how teams operate.
Well, I think anecdotally, I've heard of clubs signing players who were of similar ability based on their social media profile. Whether you think that's a positive or a negative, I'm not sure, but it has happened at some big clubs in Europe. I think as social media maybe changes, that might change, hopefully, because I don't think it's particularly a great idea. When I talk about the differences in resources for clubs, it's the same for players as well. A lot of the sponsorship and interest is concentrated on the elite big names. But as hopefully the visibility and knowledge of the women's game grows, then that spreads out. It's understandable that you maybe only know 1 or 2 players in the team,
Brilliant.
less the rest of the team. And also, we're actually seeing that in the men's game to an extent, aren't we? Where supporters follow a player, not a club.
Yeah.
So it's happening a bit in the men's game, but it is more visible, I think, in the women's game at this point in time.
Cheers. One for Adrian and Steve from Craig. How close are we to players putting maximum minutes played into contracts? Adrian, I'll come to you first.
I don't think personal view, I don't think we're that close to it. But ultimately, it's got to be led by FIFA, hasn't it, rather than individual players. It'd be an interesting conversation when it comes to the financials around that.
Steve, have you ever done a clause? I'm not playing away at Stoke on a Tuesday night.
Find yourself another club, son. No, I can't see it ever happening. A contract's a contract. You have to be available for the fixtures that are put in front of you. So
I think
I've never seen that.
The only way I think if it had any legs, this, and I'm not advocating it, is if someone decreed or reached an agreement that there was a maximum minutes across the board that players play.
And they might also introduce minutes in training. I'm sorry, I can't do that sprint because I'm out of time. I can't see that happening either.
But when there are always players that people looked at and thought, well, they always got booked just or got sent off just before Christmas, so they were doing it themselves anyway.
There's one aspect of this as well. We're focusing here on players themselves who may be unhappy at the amount of minutes they're playing. Right?
Yeah.
There will be a large number of players who would also be very strongly saying, "Get lost! I'm playing every game I can play. I'm playing every minute on the training pitch." So I have to factor it all in.
Yeah,
and Adrian, it's a squad game as well, so the lads who aren't getting as many minutes because of more fixture congestion, they should be used more free. It probably drives prices up as well.
Tony, we've seen that this season on players coming back from the European competition this summer.
Yeah,
where a lot of club managers have rested players at the first month of the season extensively, and they've not played in League Cup games. They don't always play in all the FA Cup games in the early rounds. It's about sensible management and the good managers manage their players effectively well anyway.
Okay.
It was a lot simpler, Adrian, when there was only one substitute, or even when there were no substitutes. i.e. the World Cup final.
Steve, there's only you on this webinar who can remember that, so just keep that to yourself.
Sure that's not the
keep
case.
The good old days, Steve. The good old days. Right, one final question from Paul Widdup. Hi again, Paul. Paul says 2 things. One, are we not just seeing a restructuring of football, which will ultimately reduce football playing careers? For example, in baseball, where seasons are long, the average length of a Major League Baseball player's career is decreasing and is currently under 3 years for all players. Will this be the same for football? And 2, I was wondering if this is also a PR problem in respect of fixture congestion, especially around the messaging around pre-season tours and winter break tours. Seems to be a disconnect between clubs and players. Adrian, your thoughts on that?
Back to my original point. Look, the wages are going north, so income's got to be increased, and clubs are sweating every element possible to bring in commercial revenues, but they need to keep growing their revenues through fixtures, the pre-season tours, the ones that we see, particularly the global ones with the big hitters going on. We can look at it, and from a football perspective, the coaches, do they always want it? Probably not. But it's part of what we've got now to bring the revenues in and grow the clubs commercially as well. So it's just the way we are. And I think it's really about sensible management by the players of their squads, as you said, Tony.
As from an agent's perspective, though, if the agents or the FIFPro got together and said there is a number, there is a figure, and that goes into all the players' contracts, and everyone was doing that, whether it was 50 games a season and then that's it, it makes the management a bit more difficult, but it's still the same equation, isn't it? You're resting players for certain games and you're using your squad a bit more.
But would that then not drive immediately even more power to the clubs that have got greater resources?
Yeah, probably would, yeah. But that's the same anyway, big, strong squads in the Premier League. Who's got the biggest, strongest squad? And that's what it's about.
Right. Well, we've reached time. We've covered, well, we had maybe one or two others, but we really got into those three issues there. So, Adrian, Jen, Steve, really, really appreciate your contribution this morning. Tony, any comments there before we let the guys go?
I thought, honestly, three good debates, good conversations. I was hoping we'd get 4 or 5, but I think that's going to be the nature of it. We'd like to get in depth on some of these issues. Thanks, Adrian. I know. Look, Jen jumped in at the last minute, deadline day signing. And then at 11 o'clock, just as the window was closing, I got Steve in the building.
I was on my way back from watching Manchester City.
Steve just back from Charlotte in the US. So thanks, guys. Thank you so much for that.
And I'm gonna look up Nostalgia Vacuum on some of their get some of their vinyl. So they're in vinyl.
Was there a fax machine involved at all?
Not on my thing, no. But listen, stick around, guys, because we'd love to hear from you. Obviously, we're relying on a lot of knowledge from people, and probably we've got about 100 years knowledge in this particular chat, maybe. And that's mostly Steve.
Just saying from my perspective, I presume.
All right, thanks, guys.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye.
Excellent.